Your fantasy football week on the podcast. We are getting ready for your drafts next week. Joining me today, one of the hosts of the award-winning Draft Sharks fantasy football podcast, Matt Schauf, is here. Matt, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. And glad, thanks for coming on here. Got a lot of fun fantasy stuff to discuss this week. I feel like the one thing that's very different for me, I feel like all the player movement this offseason with all of these big name guys, especially fantasy positions, moving between teams, I feel like it made it much more harder for me to prep for my draft than it usually is.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some big name wide receivers, especially on the move. And obviously the big challenge with that is we know how good they are, but how much target share are these guys getting? So then we have to decide whether we're betting on talent, whether we're worried about situation. And a lot of times it just depends on, exactly what the draft price is you're paying for that guy and who else is on the board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got not only that, you also have to factor in, like quarterback move as well. I mean, Russell Wilson going to Denver, I'm sure is going to impact all his receivers there as well.
Yeah, that was probably the first big chip, right? Tough to remember exactly when things happened, but yeah, Russell Wilson's a big one, and you can tell how excited people get about Russell Wilson, and for good reason, by where Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton immediately moved to on ADP boards. So yeah, that's been something to navigate as we move through draft season and watch exactly where those guys are going.
Yeah, in terms of this, I think there's also a challenge is all the preseason stuff because trying to sort out like who's playing in preseason games. You got reports from camps about, oh, this guy's in the best shape of their life. This guy is burning everybody at camp. Like, how do you cut through the noise when you try to get ready for your drafts?
Well, I think it's really important to take each situation as its own situation, because as soon as you think, well, this is all coach speak, I'm ignoring it, you're doing that wrong, because sometimes you'll hear things from coaches that matter. Like, for example, we've gotten not great things said about Antonio Gibson by Ron Rivera and the Washington staff since his fumble in the first preseason game. So you don't want to totally ignore the way that Ron Rivera is talking about a competition in the backfield and end up overdrafting Antonio Gibson. On the other hand, there is plenty of coach speak out there, so you don't want to take everything the coaches say at face value, because otherwise you can end up either overvaluing or undervaluing guys based on that. And then, all the camp buzz, like, we need to assume in general that guys are probably going to look pretty good at training camp. Their teams are trying to set them up in positions that are going to maximize their skills. They're going against teammates. Obviously, a lot of times they're going against second teamers. It might have rookies who are playing with the second team against the second team. So, it's really important, I think, most of all, to just look at exactly what you're looking at in each case and try to, analyze what it means there, what the upside is there. And then, after that, the effect on the price, because there's some buzz that doesn't get a guy moved appropriately on fantasy football ADP boards. And then there's some other buzz that just moves a guy too much, and suddenly you'd have to pay too much to follow him. So, again, it's just really important to look at each case as it comes up.
Yeah, absolutely here. And what is your general strategy entering your drafts this year? I know there's a lot of guys that, I have to go running back first, my first two picks. I have to go zero RBs and try and stack up the elite receivers. Like, how do you tend to play it?
I think that the only way to do it wrong is to go into your draft saying, this is what I have to do, because that's where you're setting yourself up to just take the next guy as opposed to taking the guy. And that's what I want to do, is be in position to take the guy. For example, I'm in a draft with some other, fantasy analysts right now, and it's a best ball format. So, it automatically takes our best scoring lineup each week. I started this draft with 5 straight not running back picks, and I'm not a zero RB guy. I'm not against zero RB, but it's not a strategy that I go into a draft assuming that I'm going to use. But I get into this draft, Cooper Kupp is still there as the third wide receiver on the board. Then running backs go early, and Tyreek Hill's sitting in the middle of round 2, and it's best ball, so I can kind of take the best that comes from him and not worry as much about the worst. Then T. Higgins makes it to me in round 3, so it's like, all right, I guess we're doing this. We're going to start with 3 wide receivers. Round 4, Josh Allen hasn't gone anywhere. I see that everybody else has already taken a running back in their lineup. So I know that I might not necessarily be the one who's taking the first quarterback off the board most of the time, but in this case, it makes me different and keeps my roster different from what the rest of the league is doing. But it also gives me that potential difference maker at quarterback if Josh Allen does deliver on the number one overall QB stuff. Back around after that, it's Gabriel Davis is still on the board. Again, that's a player that I'm not necessarily taking in general in drafts. I'm not targeting him going in, but in this case, he pairs with the quarterback that I just took. It still helps me to differentiate. So for me, it's all about staying flexible into and throughout your draft, because we're all going to face things in each draft that go differently than we expected going in. So I think you have to, know the landscape. You have to have ideas that you want to follow, but you have to, most importantly, be flexible and go with what that particular draft gives you.
Absolutely. I do love that strategy. Basically, my way of looking at it, I say you're playing the board. You're not really going in with a lock to solid, I have to do this. If you do that, I think you end up screwing yourself up.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll go to, obviously, let's say we're in a standard league here, 12 teams have PPR. You're fortunate to land number one pick here. What are you doing with it?
If I'm starting 3 receivers in this league, then I am probably starting that draft with Cooper Kupp most often. I wouldn't say it's 100% of the time. I also like Christian McCaffrey up there, and I do like Christian McCaffrey a little ahead of Jonathan Taylor if it's half PPR or full PPR, just because of that ultimate reception ceiling. I still think that Christian McCaffrey, if he's healthy all season, has the highest ceiling in those formats at the position. So I'm willing to take the chance, and I don't think that the injury risk is as scary as it seems. You look at McCaffrey's past 2 seasons, and he missed a ton of games, but the injuries were all unrelated to each other. It's not like he had the same knee be a problem both seasons. He didn't have the same hamstring be a problem both seasons. So we have an injury guide on DraftSharks.com that actually factors in workload, a player's history of injuries, but also the time since his last injury, and all of those things feed into this algorithm that spits out the probability that a guy will get injured. And Christian McCaffrey is not any higher than guys like Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, other high workload running backs in that first round. So when you look at the way the past 2 years went for McCaffrey, you think injury risk, but when you're weighing him against the other running backs in round 1, now he has a higher injury risk than Jonathan Taylor, who doesn't have much injury behind him, higher than Najee Harris, who doesn't have injuries behind him. But the key thing to try to look beyond here is that running backs in general are high injury risk guys. Derrick Henry would not have been somebody we'd call an injury risk player until the middle of last year when he broke his foot. And there's nothing signaling that he's going to break that foot other than that he's touching the ball a lot of times every week. And when you do that, that's the greatest signal of your risk of injury. So, just kind of circling back to McCaffrey, I wouldn't not draft McCaffrey because you're scared he's going to get hurt, because we should be scared that all these running backs are going to get hurt in the first round. So instead, shoot for that ceiling and try to overlook that risk that scares you off them.
Yeah, I've been doing my research. I have my drafts coming in a few weeks here, and I see obviously there's a big grouping of running backs that end up filling up most of the first round here. Do you have any sort of tiers for the first round running backs you're paying? If you're separating this group in class 1, this is the second class. How would you rank them?
It's really McCaffrey by himself by a little bit to start the draft, unless we're talking about non-PPR or even anything less than half PPR, because I know we have various systems at this point. After that, I think Jonathan Taylor is probably a little bit closer to the rest of the group than he would be considered in most places. So there's probably still a Jonathan Taylor only shelf behind McCaffrey. But then just behind that, I think, to me, Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, everybody in that range is really pretty close together. So I don't feel like I need to get one of those guys over the other. And Saquon Barkley is in that range as well. And I think because that range includes a couple of players that have a shot of getting into round 2, it makes me more willing to then take somebody like Justin Jefferson in the middle of round 1, or even Stephon Diggs late in round 1. Certainly Jamar Chase in the mix there as well.
All right, so let's stick with our 12-team hypothetical here. What slot in the first round is that probably you have to make the toughest choice at, in terms of you're just below the top tier of guys, you have to pick the best of the second tier?
I think the toughest spot is probably 5th or 6th, and that is assuming that Justin Jefferson is off the board. I'm assuming that the first 4 picks are McCaffrey, Taylor, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson. I think then 5, 6, and 7 get tough, because all of the running backs I like, they all just have, maybe it's an injury red flag, maybe it's what if his touchdown rate from last year, Austin Eckler in particular, what if that comes down? a little bit. So, there's just this little thing like, ooh, well, what about that with this guy? And then Jamar Chase, like, I love the player, obviously. I love the situation. Is his target share going to come up from where it was last year? I want to just go ahead and bet on the talent with him because last year I didn't bet on the talent enough, and I was wary of a rookie wide receiver, and he, blew up my expectations for him. So right in that range, it's a bunch of guys that I can talk myself out of if I try to, but that I should ultimately be talking myself into. And it's this range where, if I'm picking 10 times, I'm not sure there's one single player that I'm taking more than 3 out of those 10 times.
It's certainly interesting here. And you mentioned some of the top fantasy receivers here. We talked about Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson. Who else do you think is like below them in terms of like the like elite tier? Like these are your locked in like wide receiver ones for your team.
Yeah, I think Jamar Chase does belong up there. I do have more of a question for him with the target share, like I mentioned, just because T. Higgins is there. But like I said, last year showed me that I should just go ahead and bet on the talent and trust the Bengals to get him the ball enough. And I think he's the kind of guy who can stay overly efficient on the opportunities he does get. Stephon Diggs, I think, is getting slightly underrated up in that range. I mean, he's right around wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. So I just say slightly because we're in the range where we are splitting hairs. And I think that he belongs consistently inside round 1. I feel better about Stephon Diggs than I do Devontae Adams, just because Stephon Diggs is still with the team that he was on the past 2 years. He got strong target shares. Last year, his touchdown rate was actually lower than it really should have been. I mean, he led the league in end zone targets, but his TD rate was down below what it was back when he was with the Vikings. So I think Stephon Diggs could have, I hesitate to say bounce back because he was still a top 10 fantasy receiver last year, but because he was being drafted as a top 3 guy, it felt disappointing. So I think there's a chance that he could climb back into that range, even like ultimately score wide receiver 1 if everything breaks right for him. So I really like Stephon Diggs down in that range. And I think CeeDee Lamb has a pretty good shot of getting into that range of guys that we just consider clear wide receiver 1s, because the only real question on him for fantasy purposes there is, does he finally get that target share, that ultimate high target share? And I say finally, it's his 3rd season. So, it's not like he's been in the league forever and we know what he is. But, the hesitation for some people has been CeeDee Lamb did not command that clear number 1 target share the past 2 years. And oftentimes, historically, that guy has trouble getting into that range. But CeeDee Lamb is really set up to dominate target share this year. So, maybe he doesn't, but I'm willing to bet that he does. And I think he's a good enough player in a good enough situation and with a healthier quarterback this year to, just potentially go crazy if he does get like 27, 28% targets this year.
Yeah, it's good to know. And obviously, another position you got to be very careful with is the quarterback, because obviously if you want the big names, whether it's Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes, you're paying a premium, usually maybe he's early to 3rd round, sometimes the 4th round here. But there are values you take later, Jess. So when personally you feel like, obviously you're playing the board in all situations here, when you feel comfortable taking the quarterback, who are some guys you look at that you got to say, okay, I have feel good value getting my quarterback here?
I would say in general, in a common format, so I'm almost never going to be the one taking the first quarterback off the board, because it's unlikely that the same guy keeps leading the position. And, again, it's kind of splitting hairs. I don't think Josh Allen's going to bust, but if you can take somebody a few rounds later that also has a shot to ultimately lead the position in scoring, then obviously you're getting value. That said, if I'm in a league where everybody's drafting like that and I get into round 4, like middle of round 4, I think Josh Allen definitely makes sense there in most, common sized leagues, and assuming we're not playing in a tournament. I think after Josh Allen, I'd probably be waiting at least a round. Then it really depends on who else is on the board and what else I have on my roster. But I think starting in round 5, Lamar Jackson makes sense. I think in that mix, over those next 2 to 3 rounds, Justin Herbert certainly makes sense. He doesn't have as much of the rushing to help out as Lamar Jackson does. So I think Herbert does have the ceiling to ultimately lead the position in scoring, but he'll need like a truly abnormal passing season, which I think he's capable of. But it's, it's a little bit tougher to bet on that, the extraordinary stuff like an 8% touchdown rate or something like that. But I do think he belongs in that range if he slips, which he hasn't tended to this year. I think Kyler Murray often slips a little bit lower than he should in drafts. I think Jalen Hurts is going at a value range. I think those are 2 guys that could lead the position in scoring as well. So those are kind of the guys that I'm watching to see where they go through that like round 4 to 7 range. And if any of those guys makes it into round 7, I consider it a strong value there.
Yeah, I also forgot the receivers. One thing I didn't bring up here is that we had two of the biggest names in the NFL switch teams in the offseason. So we had Devontae Adams leave Aaron Rodgers, go to Derek Carr and the Raiders. We had Tyreek Hill leave Patrick Holmes in Kansas City, goes down to Miami with Tua Tagovailoa. Like, I would assume that Adams is the better fantasy setup, but am I correct in that assumption?
I mean, it's really tough to say. I would say Devontae Adams is in the better spot because I think that the signals are the Raiders are going to pass plenty, and we don't have to guess as much to project them to do that. Plus, he's playing with, his college quarterback, so I think that helps. Ultimately, the question for both of them is, do we see the kind of target share that we got that helped propel them each at their last stops? And I think it's a bigger question for Devontae Adams because he dominated in that area with Green Bay. Now he's got Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller around, so I think the ceiling comes down some, but does he still get to 26% in an offense that throws the ball more than Green Bay's did? I think he'll ultimately be okay, but that's why I'm taking like Stephon Diggs over Devontae Adams, just enough to push him, behind somebody else that where it really matters, where you're making a decision between those two players at the end of round 1. So Devontae Adams is like 5th, 6th on my board. I can kind of go either way between him and CeeDee Lamb. Tyreek Hill is a little bit further down because I have to, one, bet on his target share versus Jalen Waddle, who got huge target share last year with the quarterback that they're both going to be playing with this year. And then I also need to bet at least a little bit on Tua to step up in his production this year to support the production that Tyreek Hill puts forth on those targets that he does get. Like, we haven't seen very much at all of Tyreek Hill without Patrick Mahomes to know what we can expect if he gets 25% target share with a quarterback that's not Patrick Mahomes. So there's some risk there. I think in the second half of round 2, it gets to be where I'm more willing to bet on the talent of Tyreek Hill and see what happens. But there's certainly not a spot where I'm totally comfy. I guess maybe if he gets into round 3, but that's not normally happening. So Tyreek Hill's been one of those guys that I kind of hope somebody drafts before he gets to the point where I'm taking him, just so it's not me deciding not to take him.
Yeah, it makes some sense here. I'll talk about tight end for a minute here because my philosophy of tight end has always been like, if you can't get one of the elite guys who is basically like wide receiver production wise, like I try and stay away from this until at least round 10 because I'm trying to stack up the receivers and the running backs here. Like, how deep do you feel like that top tier is now for the tight ends this year? Like, and what point should you be saying, okay, I should wait for a while to like go back into this position?
I think it's an interesting position with lots of different shelves that you can kind of stop at and peruse. I think that the top shelf to me is just Travis Kelce right now, and I would consider him anywhere around the 1-2 turn. And certainly, the further he gets into round 2, the more sense he makes. I'm a little bit more hesitant on Mark Andrews just because I don't know that Baltimore throws the ball nearly as much as they did last year. Maybe they do, and if they do, he'll be a fine value where he's going. But his price is certainly way up from where it was last year, so he really needs that plus a continued strong touchdown rate to deliver. So there's less of a chance that I'm going to feel bad about not taking Mark Andrews this year than Travis Kelce, I think, at their relative prices. Behind that, I think Kyle Pitts, it's worth looking where he comes off the board, and it's more so for a full PPR format, because anywhere where I'm getting less than 1 full point per reception, I think there's more risk to Kyle Pitts because I'm not betting on big offensive fireworks from Atlanta. So outside of PPR, I don't care as much about Pitts, but inside PPR, I'm certainly watching him. If I don't land one of those two guys, Kyle Pitts maybe around the 3-4 turn, Travis Kelce around the 1-2 turn, I'm probably waiting a little bit after that because I think Dallas Goedert is mispriced a little bit by ADP. I think he's pretty similar in outlook to George Kittle. And if you can get Dallas Goedert several rounds later, then you're gaining value, even if George Kittle ends up outproducing Dallas Goedert. So those are kind of the watch players for me. But I'm also with you in that I don't feel like I need to jump on the position at any of those levels because I also really like the upside on Evan Engram and the upside on David Njoku, especially this year. And both of those guys are going very late. So if tight end just doesn't line up with where I want to take it at any of those earlier spots, I don't mind at all waiting and taking one or even both of those guys late and seeing what happens, because I think they both have the upside to turn into top 12 tight ends and guys that we start pretty much every week.
Good to know. And obviously, when you talk about fantasy, you're obviously looking at your sleepers here. Everybody has like their one or two guys who they love and say, "Oh, I have to make sure I get them on my team." Who are those guys for you this year? You're making sure that you say, "I want them on my team."
I would say Evan Ingram is one of those guys, and people hear Evan Ingram's name, they're like, "Oh God, you mean the guy that's always hurt and let me down the past 2 years?" I mean, yeah, that's the guy, and it's because he's going late in drafts, and that's the thing is, I'm not. I think that when you get in trouble is going into drafts saying, I have to have this guy no matter where he goes, or these guys are definitely going to be my guys, whatever I have to pay to get them. You know, if a guy's jumping up 3 rounds in ADP over the course of draft season, which is longer than it ever has been before, you aren't really drafting the same guy come August that you were drafting in May. So Evan Ingram has stayed low in tight end 2 territory. I, again, think he has the upside to get into the top 12. We had Hayes Carlion on our podcast. He's a Jaguars beat writer. He said he expected Evan Ingram to be among the top 3 targets for that Jacksonville team. I think they'll throw the ball plenty. I think Evan Ingram, we're starting with a guy who was a first-round pick, so we know the physical ability is there. I'm going to bet that the coaching staff for the Giants the past couple of years misused him some. But ultimately, it's just a low-cost, so then low risk bet on, the talent plus situation. Some other guys, like it really changes depending on when I'm drafting, because Romeo Doubs was somebody that I would have targeted, a month ago, maybe even a few weeks ago. He's really flying up forward, so I'm trying not to chase him too early in a draft. But, what I love about Doubs, the player is good. Everything they've been saying about him is good, but especially the opportunity. And I think that can help kind of highlight the types of players you want to look for is, early in their career receivers, first, second year especially, who are in situations where it's just not clear what's going to happen. So, if we're talking about round 12 on in drafts, you just go ahead and bet on talent. You take a shot on somebody getting more opportunities than we might be able to reasonably project right now. And that's the kind of guy that can blow up for you if the opportunity does match up with the talent and, and the price that you're paying to get him. And then suddenly by October, you have somebody that you're starting that you were drafting in round 13.
Yeah, it makes some sense here. My last question is kind of going the other way here. Obviously, every year there's always that harsh, I took this guy in the first round, he got hurt. I took this guy in the third round, he underproduced. Like, who are some guys you're trying to avoid this year?
Guys I'm trying to avoid. Let me try to bring up a list so that I can know exactly who I'm thinking about and not overlook anybody. So, like, at running back, DeAndre Swift, and I hesitate to say it because there are lots of smart fantasy people that are big on DeAndre Swift, but he concerns me at where I have to buy him, which is basically the 1-2 turn very early in round 2. I just don't know if the Lions are going to give him enough work to match up with that spot unless he's very efficient on the touches he gets. And if they do give him the workload to match up with his draft price, then they're increasing his injury risk, which has already been a question with him. So just ultimately, it's not that I hate Swift, but the range where he's going, I would much rather take Saquon Barkley. I would much rather take Joe Mixon. I'd just rather leave Swift for somebody else to see what happens. Aaron Jones, I actually haven't been on because he's in round 2 as well. And even though I think the target upside is there with Devontae Adams gone, I think there's also the chance that A.J. Dillon takes more work away from him, and also the chance that the Packers just aren't as good on offense with Devontae Adams gone, which for Jones would mean fewer touchdown opportunities, and that's been key to his value in recent seasons. Looking at wide receiver early in drafts as well, I think some of the guys that I'm really not as interested in as the market, Michael Pittman hasn't really made it onto a lot of my teams, and it's kind of similar to Swift in that I don't hate Pittman, and he sits high enough in our rankings, but there just tends to be somebody that I like better going in the range where he's going, or somebody that's just so excited about him that they're taking him before he gets to me on my board. Like DJ Moore, for example, is 3 spots higher in our PPR rankings. He's going to go later than Pittman in nearly all drafts, but he has at least as much opportunity facing him. Questions on the quarterback for sure, but you want to bet on talent plus opportunity there and then see what happens. So Michael Pittman, I'm a little bit below market on. Deebo Samuel is a big one. He started out draft season going at the end of round one, which I thought was insane. And just people, not being able to overlook their recency bias at all. He's gotten into middle to second half of round two now, and that's still just too late for me unless I'm playing in a best ball tournament where I want to get, some shares of a player that good in case he explodes in a playoff week. But in like a full season league, Deebo Samuel is not somebody that I'm anywhere close to the draft price on, because last season was just completely extraordinary for him. And I mean that in both a good way and a bad way, because obviously it takes a really good player to have extraordinary production. But the way that he produced last year was he spent the first half of the year leading the league in yards per catch. And then he spent the second half of the year scoring rushing touchdowns at just an absurdly high rate. And I don't think that either of those things is likely to happen. So it's tough for me to find him the path to being that top 8 wide receiver. Obviously, he showed us that it's possible. But when you then throw in not a rookie quarterback, but a first-time starter at quarterback, a team that doesn't want to throw the ball a ton, just volume-wise versus other teams around the league, everything has to really break his way for Deebo Samuel to stay in wide receiver 1 range. I think it's far more likely that he finishes the season more like wide receiver 16 or something like that. And if you're taking him as the 7th wideout off the board, that's a disappointing season.
That's for sure. Matt, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can people follow social media, keep up with your podcast?
Oh, yeah. So hit draftsharks.com. You can find every episode on there. You can find the links to subscribe to Spotify, Apple, YouTube. We are on those outlets as well. We're on any other outlet where you like to get your podcast. So, yeah, it's easy to find us. And, before I go, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate the time.
No problem. Thanks again, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.